So, so just so people know. Thanks for reminding me, Mike. Okay. So the main topic here, although there's some related topics that are going to creep in as well, is like the age-old question about whether beauty is in the eye of the beholder when you look at art. Do people make judgments about art based on what they observe, what they see, or is there something else that is not evident on the surface of the art you're looking at that allows us, or is what we're judging when we actually judge the quality of a piece of art, or what it means to us? And there are two questions that sometimes get mixed up, and we want to separate them a bit. Let's see, where is it? Yeah. One, we're mainly going to be dealing with the first one of these questions, not the second one. The first one is what is it that makes something art? What, see, Mike is, okay. Mike, are you there? Are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting a request saying that you want to start an AI companion. Is that, you want me to do that or what? You know what that is? I'm not sure what that is.
It just, I think you can click on it and it'll start answering questions about what's been covered so far. But you don't have to take any action really. I mean, it should be just something operating in the background.
Well, it says either Mike Archbold is requesting you to start AI companion, start or decline. You know what that's about?
Oh, just start it then, I would think. Or if you decline, if you, I don't, it's okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Does it matter? Okay.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, we could experiment around with it.
Okay. Well, what does it do?
We don't have to.
What does it do? You know?
I've only tried it once, but you should be able to get it to, for example, answer questions about any of the material covered so far.
Oh, okay.
Provide a summary, like what is this particular comment mean? Okay.
Well, I'll just go on and ignore it, and because yeah, we are going to be asking and answering the questions, not the AI, at least not yet. Anyway, the first question here is what makes something art versus non-art? This is a separate question from is it good art or bad art? That second question is probably closer to being the answer the answer to that question probably is highly subjective. In that sense, to that second question, maybe ultimately beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But the first question is a different question. It's not asking whether it's good or bad, but is it art at all or not art? What are the criteria? Philosophers like to, spell out, okay, what does it mean for something to be something? So the big part of the first question we're going to be dealing with, well, what does it take? What is it possible to define what art is and say, if it meets these criteria, then it's art. If it doesn't, then it's not art. Is that possible? And many people have tried for quite literally centuries, if not thousands of years. And it's always been controversial, and it still is. That doesn't mean there's nothing to be said about what is art and what is not art. There actually is a lot to be said about it, but it's not a simple like a definite. There is in philosophy of language something called a closed concept versus an open concept. And a very closed concept is one where you can spell out exactly what something is. If it meets these criteria, then it's whatever it is you're defining. And other concepts are very wide open, and art might be one of the most wide open of all, maybe the absolute paragon of an open concept. But most actually everyday concepts are somewhere in the middle. They have some things you can say to them that more or less define them, but they're not totally closed. For example, let me give you an example of an extremely closed concept. A triangle. It's a three-sided closed figure. Or a bachelor. A bachelor is an unmarried male. If you don't meet those qualifications, then you aren't a bachelor. If you're married, you're not a bachelor. If you're not male, then you're not a bachelor. Same thing with the triangle. If you don't meet those two qualifications, you're not, whatever it is you're describing is not a triangle. That's a very closed concept. Most things out there don't fit or neither closed nor open. They're sort of in the middle. In fact, vast majority of concepts are in the middle. So, for example, just about anything else you can imagine. What is it? Let me see if we can find the section where there's an example. I can give a good example. Okay. And a lot of concepts can start out people thinking they're closed, but it turns out they're open. A good example, historical example of that is for a long time in Europe, it was considered part of the definition of being a swan that was white, until they discovered a little over a century ago, there were actually a couple centuries ago, there were black swans in Australia, which they had never seen before in Europe. So suddenly the definition of a swan did not include being white. So a concept can go from being thought to be closed to being open. Same thing with many other things. Water, H2O, you would think that was a very closed concept. That if it doesn't have that chemical composition, then it's not water. But in fact, there is such a thing as D2O, which is deuterized water, which is a version of water that actually exists in nature, though it's very rare. And even T2O, tritiated water, which is, those of you who are chemists can explain this in greater detail, but these are kinds of water that were discovered in recent times, relatively recent times, and their chemical composition is not quite the same as H2O, even though they do occur in nature, though these last two, the D2O and the T2O, are very, very rare. But that's an example where water, you would think, would be a very closed, defined concept, and maybe it was for a while, but no longer is. So, but art, okay, those are in-between concepts. For example, marriage is a good example of a concept that has become open in very recent historical times. It used to be legal and only defined between men and women. Now, in many parts of the world, there are same-sex marriages, so that concept is no longer a purely heterosexual concept, but it used to be. Okay, art is at the other extreme. Whenever people try to spell out what it is, somebody else points out an exception. And this keeps happening again and again. So that's why it's hard to answer this. However, having said that, though, there have been interesting attempts to list features or prototypical features of what constitutes art, meaning things with these features, especially if they have a lot of these features, tend to be called art. And if they don't have any of these features, they tend not to be called art. But that doesn't mean that you must have all these features, nor does it mean that if you have any one or two or three of them, that you're automatically art or that you're automatically not art. They're just features or properties that are often associated with art. And I'll give a list. This list comes from, in the write-up, from a philosopher named Dennis Dutton, who wrote, he's no longer alive, but wrote extensively about the subject. Here's a list of some of those features. For example, skill and virtuosity. If the work shows some kind of skill or virtuosity, that's often associated with art, but it's not exactly necessary, as we'll see. Novelty and creativity, is it something new that's never been seen before, or it's sort of rare? That's often associated with being art, but again, it's there for every one of these, there's an exception. Representation, and this one has got lots of exceptions, but it used to be, representational art used to be where you could actually see what it was the artist was. You could discern what the artist was trying to paint, like a portrait of a person, an animal, a landscape. So it represented something, as opposed to abstract art, where it's not supposed to be a picture of anything in particular. So abstract art is still considered art, but it's not representational. Another candidate is expressive individuality. And this one is that it actually expresses something of the artist mind, or their essence, what they're trying to accomplish. Something about them they're expressing their individuality, and it comes through in the piece. This one is considered, of all the items on this list, this is one of the ones that is considered pretty close to being essential, but maybe not totally. But the others are easy to find exceptions. Emotional saturation is another one. Does it conjure up some emotions of some sort? If the art is completely sterile and doesn't conjure up any kind of reaction, emotional reaction from you, it's hard to see it as art. But there are examples of things that don't, that still people want to call art. Or at least if there is an emotion associated with it, it's a kind of, if that makes sense, abstract emotion. We'll talk about these in detail in a moment. Direct pleasure is another feature, that it gives some kind of pleasure to experience the piece. But this is not always true either. There are types of art that frankly are just the opposite, can be painful to observe, can be scary. People go see horror movies on purpose, not because you would think, or see tragedies, for example, which, unless you are a statist, maybe we are, doesn't give direct pleasure the way, say, a donut would, you know. But a donut's a good example of something that gives direct pleasure, but is not considered art. So lots of things can give pleasure that are not art, but still, often, art pleasure of some sort is associated with art. Another feature that's considered, at least not, maybe not a feature of all art, but of certain kinds of art that endure, that were considered great art, and that's intellectual challenge. There's something about them that forces you to think or rethink something, and it continues to do so over time. That may not be a feature of all art, but it definitely, some would say it's a necessary feature of art that endures for a long, long time in terms of estimation. Imaginative experience is another feature that's very common. If it doesn't exercise your imagination at all, it's likely not art. But I'd be hesitant to say that all art must do that. But it's high up on the list. Other things that have been listed as associated with art are culture of criticism. This means that there's a culture out there, a community of people who know a lot about that art and discuss it and have standards of what they consider acceptable. The world of museums and art critics and art historians, for example, there's a whole culture around this particular art form. If there is no culture around a particular art form, that to some people means that it's probably not art. However, there is it's been pointed out that there actually is such a thing as outsider art that is where the artist may not even realize that they are an artist, and there is no recognition of them except perhaps after they're long gone, and they never were associated or connected with the art world. That's a whole genre of art called outsider art, which is at some point appreciated, but may not be appreciated in real time, during the lifetime of the artist, for example, or by a very large community. Another three more things. One is style, that the art represents some sort of, has a feature that is recognizable, and as opposed to there's nothing about it that stands out. Another feature is special focus, that sometimes a piece of, this is where it relates to what Mike said at the beginning about is photography art. It's been said that if you can take a piece of driftwood on the beach, as long as it's on the beach, it's not art. But if something about it attracts you, you bring it inside, you put it on the mantelpiece, or you put it on a frame, that makes it art. Just you're framing it. To literally frame something, anything, makes it art, at least under some conception. So when you're taking photographs, your choice to make that particular photograph of whatever it is bringing focus on that item. It's representing, it has an element of expressive individuality, because you chose that, unless you accidentally push the the button on your camera and you didn't intend to take it. But if you intended to take it, then that already expresses one of the main central features. So that's another aspect that's present often, but not always in art. And finally, existing within art traditions or institutions. Actually, this is related to the culture of criticism, that there actually are museums and experts in that field who can judge and there's a long tradition of people who know a lot about that particular art. If something doesn't have that tradition or institutions around it to validate it, then that's a strike against its being art. However, that's not by any means suggesting that something can't be art if it doesn't have that feature about it. So all of these things, these were all identified or suggested by Dennis Dutton, who's a philosopher. And there's a link to an article by his, that's a very good one, where he discusses why he thinks these are common. This may not be an exhaustive list. There may be things that are important to art that I didn't list or that aren't listed here. And it's certainly, again, I want to emphasize, none of these things are what philosophers call necessary conditions, that you must have all these or any one of them to be art, nor are they sufficient conditions, meaning if you have any one of these, that doesn't make it art either. It's just that these things are often associated with something's being art. And so anyway, this is a okay, of the items on that list, as I said, none are necessary and sufficient, but there are a couple of them that some theorists think are not very close to being necessary conditions. Maybe not, it's debatable, but some of them are easily not necessary conditions, like representation, for example. An art piece doesn't have to look like anything to be art. It may have just aesthetic features that you respond to and expresses emotion. And a good example of this is I'm going to try to share my screen and show you an example of what I'm talking about, just to make it clear. Let's see, here we go. Okay. Where is it? Some of this. Nope. I'm not very okay. So I can't minimize. Anyway, in the write-up that you can see if you click on the extended write-up, there's pictures in there. And one of them is a very famous painting by a painter in I think it was painted in the early 70s, 1970, I believe, by Mark Rothko. It's called Black on Gray. It's one of the most famous abstract paintings of all time. To some people, it doesn't express anything. It's just the top part of the frame is shades of black and gray. The bottom part's light white and gray, and that's it. I think it's sold for $81 million. Just why would a piece like this, which doesn't seem to express, at least superficially, anything, sell for that much? Well, it's been suggested that, well, for one thing, Rothko, it expresses, and this is something I want to get into in greater detail in a moment, a tremendous amount of intentionality, and we'll get to that, explain that in a moment. But there is a let's see what I was going to say about it. Oh, its emotion. Does it represent anything? No. Was it intended to represent anything? No. But it was intended by the painter, and it succeeded in the eyes of many, of expressing an emotion, a dark emotion. The artist. Somebody has their mic on. Okay. Anyway, the artist was trying to express a really dark feeling, and some people who stood in front of this painting have started to weep. He committed suicide not too long after painting this. It was a very highly respected artist who produced a great deal it took him a long time to be recognized, but it's an example of a piece of art that is neither representative nor does, but it does seem to emanate, he intended it to emanate emotion, in this case, a dark emotion, a sense of darkness. So but it's just visually just black, a field of black over a field of grayish white. And that's all. Other examples, well, I'm not going to get into too many more examples of that at the moment, but I do want to talk about this core idea that Ellen Winter talks about. Two elements that she thinks, and they're built on what we just talked about. What was it? Intentionality and context. She argues that what matters in a piece of art, what most people matter, by the way, she's an empirical psychologist. She's not actually talking about what philosophers say matter. She went out there and asked people, what do ordinary people consider art? How do they react to pieces? So she's trying to get empirical information about what people consider art and not art. And two things that came out that do seem to be important in not exactly defining, but at least coming close to help us grasp when something is art and when it's not. One of them is context. That piece by Mark Rothko that's black over white, without knowing something about the context of it, you may not get it at all. But it actually is highly significant. What he was trying to get across, a meaning, a message, a serious one, and that's which you can't see with your eyes. You have to know something about the context of the painting to get it. So I'm going to read from the write-up what we're talking about here with context. The piece of art, to have the kind of context we're talking about, captures an instance of time or place or predicament or mood or recognizably shared orientation, etc., that has wide and enduring resonance. It may document an achievement in expression or in the history of aesthetic capability or sensibility, anything from personal despair at the disjointed time we were living in to a technical discovery forever altering the course of art history. For example, linear perspective or the capturing of light. If someone nowadays, it's not a big deal to have for someone to paint a painting that has perspective on it, but it was in the history of art a time when that had not been discovered yet. So that an artist who first perfected the skill of linear perspective was doing something great. Or some people have said that Vermeer, Johannes Vermeer, did the same thing with capturing light. So these are, but to know this context is not the important thing. It's not necessarily right there at the edge of your senses. It's not what you're seeing. You have to know something about how the process through which the artist went through to create it, what's their intention, which is the next item here, by the way. The other item that's pretty close to being essential to art is intentionality. You see something in the art that was clearly not an item of random. There wasn't randomness there. There was a high degree of intentionality versus even if it appears it's random, it's deliberately random, which is a form of intentionality, as opposed to that piece of driftwood just surfacing on the beach, which had no intentionality behind it. But if you put it on your mantelpiece, or you pick up a feather from a bird, or there's an example from Banksy, a contemporary artist who put a regular faucet, like kind of you connect a garden hose to. He put it in a frame and called it "This is a pipe." And it's an important statement. It's similar. It's actually a play on what's it? I think it's
Duchamp.
Well, who?
A play on Duchamp and his urinal that he said was a
right. Yeah, actually, no, you're right, it's related to that, but there's I think it's by Moreau or someone else, where he has an actual smoking pipe, and he says this is not
Magritte. Rene
Magritte.
Magritte.
Correct, Magritte. He has a famous painting where he has a smoking pipe and he has a subtitle that says, "This is not a pipe." So Banksy was clearly playing off that by saying, putting a garden hose faucet in a frame and saying, "This is a pipe." So you in that case, the intentionality is very clear. It becomes a little bit more difficult sometimes to see that intentionality, but especially if it's very rich, is usually a sign that this is a high level of art. But it exists even in lower doses, so to speak, even in the work of children and animals. According to some psychologists, Ellen Winter, as a matter of fact, she studied child art and said that by age 2, even children who do art are beginning to show that they intend to do something. It's not just random paint or anything, or smears, or their intention is there, even if their execution isn't quite up to their ability to intend something, but they definitely have an intent.
And animals?
Well, that's more controversial, but some would say that even animals, to some extent, again, we human beings, unless you take some biblical way out of this, did evolve from animals. So there isn't anything about us that you can't find in some degree or other in the animal world. Even our animal intelligence has been studied to a great degree. They can figure out, they can solve puzzles. Now, to what degree, we can often see animals building nests, for example. They're not accidentally, randomly building nests. They have a plan. And so that you can see in nature all around you that, at least in the animal world, maybe not in the natural erosion of a landscape is hard to see that as intentional on nature's part. But in the case of animals, some degree of it does appear to be there. Now, exactly, where that cuts off and do plants, for example, have intentionality? It's a harder case to make, but some would argue that, yeah, because they're not randomly just there. Their roots grow toward water and nutrients, their leaves turn toward the sun. They clearly have trying to do something in their environment with it's not random. But expressing it in a form that, in the case of plants who are just looking for nutrients to stay alive, art is often seen as not utilitarian. It's not about you have to appreciate art in order to live. It seems like to many that it's above and beyond a necessity to preserve your existence, but it's still, like those things you do to preserve your existence, it does reflect a great deal of intentionality, or can. Okay. Now these two things that she points out: context, that it's aware of its environment, and that environment is shaping to some degree the work that the artist is doing, and that it's not random. Even if it may appear to be random, but it isn't. The artist is doing something on. Jackson Pollock's, for example, those of you familiar with his stuff, it seems like he's dripping paint on a canvas in a random sort of way. But you don't actually even have to be an art expert to see that it's not totally random. One of the things that Ellen Winter did in her book is she deliberately went out and asked people with no art background. She didn't want artists. She didn't want philosophers of art or art critics or art historians' opinion. She wanted ordinary people's opinion. And she presented them with a piece of abstract art that was actually put together, created by a famous abstract artist, next to a piece that was painted by an animal or a small child, but they looked superficially the same. They resembled each other. And she asked them without labeling them which one was. So one of them is by an artist, one of them is by a child. Can you tell which is which? And she repeatedly did this with large different cohorts of people, and she came up, and it was a consistent response. she called it the 2/3 rule, that 2/3 of everybody were 2/3 of ordinary people were able to guess correctly. So it wasn't that the child art and the abstract art are, because some people, as she said, say, well, my kid could do that, when they as a criticism of abstract art. And these are not art historians or art aficionados, but just ordinary people. She found that ordinary people can tell the difference between a piece that superficially resembles an art piece, an abstract art piece that superficially resembles the work of a child artist. And 60% of the time, ordinary people can tell the difference when they're. She even to make it harder, she even deliberately presented them sometimes with mislabeled ones where there was a label indicating this was done by an artist, but it wasn't. It was done by a child, and still people said that doesn't look like a child art. It looks like an artist who did it. Now, 60% doesn't mean everybody does. So there's obviously some people who really can't tell the difference, but apparently most people, ordinary people, not art experts, can tell the difference, according to her empirical studies. All of which she points out that this suggests that there is something about art that is not in the eye of the beholder. It's not just a matter of it's art to one person and not art to someone else. No, there's actually something there that we're seeing. And what she speculates is that, and by the way, this was testing for intentionality, not context, because they didn't know anything about who the artist was or what their life story was. That's a separate feature, context, being affected by context, knowing the process and the history of how a piece of art came into being. That's one thing. The other one is what you actually see in the piece itself. And there's something called intentionality that it's not, that apparently is discernible by ordinary people. It's not just art experts who obviously, if you've been studying art for a very long time, you probably have a better sense of this than the ordinary person. But even the ordinary person gets it right 60% of the time, according to her. Okay, I'm going to pause right here and get some reactions from people, and then I'm going to move on to another fascinating topic that's related to this, and that's forgeries. Okay, so does anybody have any reactions or thoughts, comments, or about this so far?
I have two comments. I'm Kate.
Okay, Kate.
One is from my experience as a teacher of art and a museum goer. And information indicates to us that people tend to look at a piece of art for not more than 8 to 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds at the most. So their perceptual issue of how you look at something like a Rothko may be really limited by that mere fact of what the perceptual work of most people. And all you have to do is walk into a museum and watch people move quickly past the work. So I think that may be a factor in developing intentionality, particularly. The other thing I think is that may be important to mention is that we tend to look at art these days. We live in an age of reproduction, so we're never looking at the real thing. We're watching a screen. We're looking at a reproduced image of a photograph. We're not there at the space. And all those issues of reproduction, in my mind, also affect how we perceive the art.
Yeah. How do you think, Kate, how do you think it affects how we perceive the art?
I think it limits the way that we could experience some of these other things that Dutton talks about.
Yeah.
The idea of emotional saturation. If they're only looking 10 or 15 seconds, they're hardly getting any of that. Direct pleasure, yes or no, they walk past it or they look at it. And they miss it completely, probably because they're not interested in art. Anyway, the culture of contextual ideas. I think they miss a lot. I think people miss a lot. And so I think, anyway, that's my perception.
No, that makes sense, Kate. In fact, in Ellen Winter's book, again, these features that we listed, Dutton's list, there is are just things that Dutton thinks are associated with art. They may not be always there. But one about regarding emotion, for example, because you mentioned that, and the ability of a piece to draw out some kind of emotional response is, although it's probably there for all pieces of all kinds of art, all genres of art, there is a difference between, and this may be a future topic in and of itself, and that's the philosophy of music. Music has a very direct relationship with emotion that the visual arts often don't have. It takes a little bit of time to observe and absorb a piece of visual art to begin to feel, well, especially if it's abstract. Obviously, if it's a representative painting of a person crying, it's kind of obvious why you might feel sad. But if it's not, as in the Rothko examples, there's no one crying, there's not even a recognizable figure there. But it may take some time. Visual arts seem to have a slightly more distant relation there. The emotion is a part of it, but music is like direct. People don't need very much time to react to sad music or happy music before they get a reaction. It's like seems to have a direct line to people's emotional capacities. And she talks about both the similarities. There are similarities between especially we're talking about the music is like abstract art. We're talking about music without lyrics, just music. And it's a bit of a puzzle to philosophers as to how it is that just noises, what their connection is with our emotional response. But that there is a connection and that it's very immediate is very clear. And it seems to be more immediate with music than with the visual arts. People know right away after a few pieces of notes whether they like something or don't like it, or how they're going to react to it. With visual arts, sometimes people may be taken, they may not actually like it at first, but it may, as they say, grow on you after a while as you begin to study it and understand more about it. Whereas with music, very little changes. If you hear one piece the first time and you don't like it, very rarely is your opinion going to change when you learn more about the music. That seems to be a difference between those two art forms. Elizabeth and Barbara, I forget who.
Oh yeah, Mike had his hand up first, I think, Victor, and then Barbara, and then me.
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, the outlier artist. I hadn't heard of that before. Do you have an example that comes to mind in particular? I didn't get anything Googling it a minute ago.
Okay. Well, actually, I can't think of I've watched, okay, these are examples, and I can't remember somebody's name specifically. But there have been cases of, like, for example, a guy who was a recluse who lived alone in his apartment and had, unknown to anybody else, had been painting these incredibly intricate landscape paintings, which must have taken many years, in some cases decades. And no one knew that he was doing this. He died. And when they went into his apartment, they found all these pieces. And they were incredibly impressive. He had no training in art. He had no connections with the art world. He never showed or even told people that he was doing this art. That's an extreme case, but there are other examples like that of people who are not part of the existing art institutions, who simply do art for whatever reason they want to do it, but they're not really trying to pass themselves off as artists, yet who do create things that once they're revealed and appreciated, they can be appreciated by others as being art. They're not connected to existing institutions that's outsider art. It could happen in writing. There are people who've written novels, there are philosophers even who've written about things and not made a splash at all while they're alive, and their work is discovered maybe long afterwards or something.
Yeah, it seems like the Neoplatonists and some obscure philosophers would start to become art, possibly to some people.
Except they were part of an establishment when they were around. I mean, they were known as philosophers. Outsider art, as I understand it, is someone who's outside the system, not even trying to be part of the system, but who nevertheless creates something that when it comes to light is appreciated as being art. Okay, Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, when we're talking about context, and you had talked about 60% of people could recognize art from just doodling or drivel.
Well,
It seems to me,
they recognize intentionality is what you were saying specifically.
right. Well, I think what they're recognizing is that that everybody's more or less immersed in the Western art aesthetic. Whether or not you realize it, because you can't avoid it everywhere you go. There's a print, you buy things for your house. The aesthetic is everywhere. So the idea that, let's say Jackson Pollock, he just did random drips. He actually didn't. He curated those drips.
Yeah.
If they had all looked bad to him, he would have thrown them out.
Right.
So there was some aesthetic principle that we all kind of share that made him choose those drips. And then we sort of look at them and, well, some people scoff, but we look at them and we say, yeah, we can kind of relate to that. There's some message and there's some, context that we share. And so I'm not surprised that 60% of the people were able to guess right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. And she does mention in the lecture and more in the book she wrote, Ellen Winter, does say that intentionality specifically that we're talking about here, and the fact that there's an individual artist there expressing themselves and their interactions with their world, those things are she admits are very Western ideas. There are outside the Western world, there are cultures where they don't care, it could care less who did it or anything about their context. They just see it in and of it as they see it as an art object, but who created it and what process there was or history there was behind the creation is of no value. Or at least that was a criticism that was made of this point that she was making. And I suspect that I'm not sure if that's been studied to see if that, to what extent. He's, for example, doing cross-cultural studies. Is it, and it could be that this concern with expressive individuality and intentionality is a very Western thing, and it's not universal about art. That's a possibility. She does mention that. Thanks. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was picking up on Kate's point about people speedily looking in art galleries and things. And one thing I find, because I go to art galleries, and I find that how the artist has named their piece informs my reaction to it. So, for example, that black and white picture that Mike posted in the chat, if that was untitled, I would have a reaction to it. But if the artist had, say, called it The Embrace of a Winter's Night, I might have a warm reaction to it. If he'd called it Suicide, I'd have another reaction to it. And do you know what I mean? And so quite often the naming of the art is as important as the piece itself. To me, I don't know if other people agree, but I really react to the titling of things.
I wanted to, this is Bruce. I wanted to, by way of trying to generate more discussion, get back to the original notion. What is art?
Yeah.
And a fine artist who sells her work and who also teaches at a 4-year school or 2-year school, said to me once that, and here when I speak of art, let me interrupt myself. Here when I speak of art, I'm talking about painting and sculpture and the so-called plastic arts, not music. And she said that art can be, or what we accept as art or call art, can be criticized and looked at from the point of view of 3 things only: line, form, and color.
Mhm.
And if that's true, it seems to me that I would add that it causes an emotive or intellectual or both reaction in the viewer, that line, form, color, and a viewer reaction makes it art. And if it doesn't have those three things, at least, and doesn't cause an intellectual or emotive reaction,
Mhm.
then it's not art. And if it does, it is art. And I just throw that out there
Mhm.
for comment.
Okay, does anybody else want to say anything? Okay, I'll respond to that, Bruce. Line, form, and color. Well, does that mean that everything that has those things is art? Because it seems
No,
that a lot of
no,
stuff
no.
has all those things, but we wouldn't consider art. So that might be a necessary condition for art, but it's clearly not a sufficient condition, right? Or what do you
Yeah,
think?
okay. All right. Fair enough.
Well, what philosophers are always trying to do, for better or for worse, is that they're looking for both all the conditions something has to have before the things it must have to be candidates to be considered art, and then those things that if it has those things, it's a candidate for art, and then if it has something else, that would make it art. That would be a sufficient condition. A good example of that is it's a necessary and sufficient condition for someone to be a bachelor if they're an unmarried male. It's not. There's a very sharp, very clear definition there. But for art, even the visual arts, even sticking with those, and it's clearly not the case for other kinds of art, but even for visual art, yes, those conditions, those things might be present in all forms of visual art, line, form, and culture, or some and color.
Color.
But it's hard to say that's if anything that has those features is art. The sufficient condition part is missing, it seems like.
Yeah, that may be true.
Yeah. And it may not be possible. I mean, that's one of the things that at the very end of her write-up, I mean, her book, and also many other, including Dutton, for example, and some others that I mentioned in the write-up. The consensus seems to be, although not everyone agrees, but a lot of people think that among concepts, art is the quintessentially most open one of almost anything else you can name. Nothing else. It's like if you say something is art, you don't necessarily have to specify why you think it's art. If you think it's art and other people start thinking it's art, then it becomes art, just in virtue of people thinking that it's art, even if they can't specify why. Although people do, as philosophers especially, like to specify, they want to say it's got to have context, it's got to have intentionality. If it doesn't have those things, it's hard to see how it could possibly be art. They want to say that, but the thing is, almost anything can acquire those things if you frame it correctly. This is why one of the features was special focus. Even ordinary things that people do can become art simply by you calling attention to them. The calling attention to them makes them art. Is one of the features of art. Putting, something you put a piece of trash on in a frame makes it art. Not necessarily good art, but art. Go ahead.
I want to address that too, if I may. The idea of context and intentionality. What if an object was hung in a museum that we would all call abstract art, and the top art critics on the planet came and looked at it and had reactions, strong reactions, good or bad. And people who'd never been in a museum in their life had 100% in both cases. Art critics and people who'd never been in a museum before, 100% of them had a reaction. that to me, that to me would be art. It would be art, but not art, not something done necessarily with context or intentionality, but because it was later shown that the artist was an elephant who had been taught to pick up brushes and stick the brush into various cans of paint and had made this thing. And so it had no context in its creation. It had no intentionality. Anyway, that I don't buy context and intentionality.
Okay, it's defining of art, right? You don't think
Pardon me?
You don't think that context and intentionality are that
Are
defining art?
essential.
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, there is a famous philosopher of art, I can't remember his name. He was writing in the 60s who had he was reacting to Andy Warhol when Andy Warhol's stuff first came out. And he said he had a revelation. He said, you know, what art is, his definition is, it's a social construction. It's whenever you get a bunch of people who say this is art, that's it, it's art. You don't need to say any more about it. If you start having institutions that grow up around it, like museums and art historians and people who talk about it over dinner and create concepts to describe it, you create a culture around it. That culture is a defining of what is art. It doesn't have to meet any other criteria other than being having a society, a community of people who think it's art. That sounds like what you're saying, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's actually I can't remember this. It starts with a D. Anyway, but there is a philosopher who actually made that argument. He said art is a literal social construction. That view, well, Ellen Winter in her book, the person we're discussing mostly in this topic, doesn't agree with that. She thinks that she thinks there are evolutionary, even biological reactions to art that are pretty hardwired into us. It's not that culture and environment don't affect us, they do, like this East versus West concern with intentionality. Maybe it's more of a Western thing than a universal human thing. Maybe that's true. But there are studies that show that even people across cultures do, the studies I remember that she cites are in music. Sad music, for example, even they looked for cultures deep in the Amazon jungle who had never heard any Western music at all. And they tried to elicit emotional reactions from music that we in our culture would consider either happy or sad, to see if they also labeled them the same way. They had no experience with our kind of music. And although basic human emotions turned out to be, or things in a major key versus a minor key, for example, do seem to be closely connected with our very biology. The fact that the theory is that, for example, slow music that is subdued and quiet and slow tends to be associated with sadness, even in cultures that don't share our Western exposure to music. Now, more subtle. Now, there is something to be said for the cultural inflection of all this, because there are more subtle emotions like melancholy, and more complex emotions that are like amazement, that are not simple. Simple emotions are like sadness, anger, joy, as opposed to more subtle emotions. Those do tend to be much more culturally shaped than these basic emotions. So something in there does appear culturally independent. Now, and she thinks that this, I think she does have there's some evidence to show that that's true about the visual arts as well, to some extent. There's room for both culture and nurture and nature here, but it's not all one or the other, no, at least according to her results. Aaron and Elizabeth? Go ahead, Aaron.
Elizabeth was before me, so
Okay,
her hand was up
Elizabeth,
before.
go ahead.
Oh no, Aaron, you're first. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. So I do think, there's sort of an epistemological debate. Are we defining the language of what we use to describe art and all of its reflections versus what we are experiencing, or we suggest that we experience across, us as a species, and what we define as a let's just say a primitive form of art and behavior. And I think what happens is that it's easy to sort of tangle those two up. I think to me, it's pretty obvious that we've had a very primitive form of capacity to generate creative form and structure and experience, going back very long time, hundreds of thousands to probably millions of years. And there's probably some species we don't even know about, and maybe we'll never find that also had very similar capacities. Especially if we extend it to sound and music, and you can argue birds, you can argue whales. There's a lot of species that communicate in artful form of communication styles, which where mating rituals end and where some kind of creative capacity begins, I mean, who knows? I mean, it's I think that would probably be open for debate. But then there's the more philosophical definition of art, which is really something only of the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, that human beings have had enough language and enough capacity to be extremely specific in how we use that language to define things. And then I would say this sort of hyper form of the language in the last few hundred years, where our idea of criticism and sort of advanced philosophy meeting criticism, and art, which really forms this almost label at this point, can then be used as a representation. You could, instead of saying art, you could say human, you could say family, you could say state, you could, war. I mean, you could put a lot of things in there and then have a whole tree, or lattice matrix of analysis and criticism. And I think it's challenging if you try to merge those two, because then everyone gets lost in their own proportional sense of where they see something that gives them a reaction or beauty or whatever art, whatever their value structure is to art, versus what language is. Because I do think in the modern world, like the world we're in now, it's clearly especially the art world, it's completely postmodern. And you could argue there's whatever postmodern, but it's this world of criticism, and criticism of the criticism is really the defining nature of it. And that's very different than most of the art that we've at least documented, that we define in terms of beauty or human form, right? Human form going back thousands of years. And then what you would say is expressionism. And then once we kind of swung to abstraction, it was like we were on this freight train all the way to advanced criticism. And I think we still label it all art because we have that as a definition, even though art, the way it was defined 1,000 years ago, was skill and craft, right? I mean, it had nothing to do with the way we call it art in the West. And then in Arabic and in various form of Chinese, whether Mandarin, Han, etc., other languages, they don't even use that same structure of defining art that way. So, I mean, I do think it's easy to get hooked on the label of art, and that's its own fight or its own understanding. And I do take that sort of social construction view of it in the modern world, because I just don't think there's any other way to do it, because we're told what's art, and as Elizabeth told us and others, it's we're hit over the head around the clock. You buy a book, got art on the cover. It's just everything is just you're bombarded with art,
Mhm.
And I think now we see art the way if someone said, what are they doing over there? You'd say playing sports, right? I mean, it's just like you wouldn't have to know what the exact game and rule is. You could just see the activities. And I do think art at this point in modern world is really like that
Mhm.
because we're just subsumed within the commercial world and even the non-commercial world.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Well,
I don't know
yeah.
if that made any sense. I hope it made some sense in 3-4
So,
minutes.
if I understood you correctly, you're saying that you like the idea that art is a social construction.
Well, that art is now a social construction. I don't think
And
art is.
it wasn't always, or we don't know.
Um, I mean, A, we don't know. B, it seems that it was far more connected to our developing concepts and philosophy and aesthetics and language, and we attached we were figuring out how to understand what maybe the relationship of nature and beauty and ourselves to that was while we were still sort of in this Hobbesian world.
Okay.
I mean, you could argue still are, but I mean, we were really in it. And we were looking to create those separations and make them more distinct. You know, if you go back, to Greeks or Romans, or you go back to any of the religious movements around art, whether they're, Arabic or anything in the medieval eras. So, I think that's very different than today. You go to a modern museum of art and you look at any one of, thousands
Yeah.
of postmodern artists
Mhm.
who are, telling and explaining detailed criticisms
Right.
or advanced representation.
Okay. I want to let Elizabeth and then Barbara go ahead. Elizabeth.
Mine's just a really quick one. I don't know, because this relates to the UK, so I don't know if you'll have heard of it. I've just put a link in the chat. Tracy Emin exhibited at the Tate her bed that she'd slept in.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an example to me of where intentionality is really the only thing that makes it art, because the actual physical, because it's such a common mundane thing that she's showing that it's hard to relate to it as art, and it's really only the intentionality and the kind of controversy around her quirkiness that made it art. And in that case it really was just a social construct, I think.
Yeah. Elizabeth, yeah, we actually several years ago, we actually did another meetup on a different, I forget the aspect of art, and we used that. Yeah, you're talking about her unmade bed.
Yeah, in the late 90s, and it
I
was
think it sold
shortlisted
for
for the
$2
Turner
million
Prize.
or something like that. $2 million at the time. Okay, for those of you who haven't seen it, just look up Tracy Emin's unmade bed. She basically, my understanding of what I remember about it, she had her bed that she had apparently she had gone through a very depressing part of her life, and she said she didn't get out of her bed much at all for a long time, and you see her bed is full of underwear, and on the side of the bed are bottles of vodka, used condoms, you name it, cigarettes, and it looked like a mess basically. And she said she got out of bed one day and she said, well, this looks like art, and she sold it to a gallery for $2 million. Anyway, so your question was, does that intentionality? Well, actually, I do think intentionality here just means that if she the very fact that she tried to pass it off as art is intentionality. She's doing something on purpose here. She's trying to raise the mundane up to a higher, to what we said earlier, create special focus to frame it. By putting this unmade bed in a museum, suddenly people look at unmade beds differently from they might have looked at them otherwise. She's calling attention to it. Yeah, that was, yeah, if you can Google it, you can find it. Anyway, Barbara, go ahead. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Elizabeth, too. Yeah, that was kind of funny. But, it sort of goes back to what Aaron was trying to, I think, draw a distinction between art back in the day or something, and art as a social construction today. And to me, it's the difference between this impulse we have to represent things, which is, I think, basic, and which does encompass intentionality and a common kind of context that everybody shares. When you see something that inspires you or moves you, you want to represent it somehow. And then you have the other half of this now, which is the unmade bed portion, which would be commodification. So now you really have two completely different categories. And I don't think it was possible to think about commodification, maybe, well, I could be wrong about that. I'm going to take that one back. But let's just say that that everybody kind of shares this intrinsic feeling that when I see something, I want to represent it. I want it to come out of me into the world. And I think that that's where art starts, and then maybe gets a little contaminated when there becomes a market for it.
Right. Actually, we're going to talk about the interplay between market and art, and the very question of what is art in a moment when we go to the next section. There are two other things that she talks about that are going to offer more support for the idea of context and intentionality as being close to essential elements for something to be called art. And they're going to come out of what happens in forgeries, for example. And also, what's the other idea? Forget. Oh, okay. Okay, well, maybe I should, I'll start in on that. Unless somebody else has a question, this other part. Okay, there is in the short write-up that's on the Meetup site, as well as in the extended write-up, there's a link to a documentary, a fairly recent one, about someone who's considered one of the great forgers of the 20th century. His name is Wolfgang Beltracchi, and he's he took his wife's last name. He's actually, I forget what it was. He's German, and let's see, what did he? Oh, yeah, I just saw that thing again. It's pretty amazing documentary because of this market forces interacting with what is art. Okay, if art is a social construction, then what explains why it is that people often spend vast amounts of resources or take in wanting, say, and valuing an original piece of art versus a perfect copy of it? If it's all about what we agree has value. In fact, Beltracchi is a perfect example. For about 30 or 40 years, he fooled the art world, the most sophisticated art world, all the experts throughout Europe. And he would paint. He wouldn't take a famous painting and recreate it. What he would do, he would study the methods of famous artists, or started out small with semi-famous artists, and created something in the style of that person, and then passed it off and sold it to art galleries. At first, he was making a few $1,000s. Then it became hundreds of thousands of dollars, then millions. And he was very good. Okay, there's no doubt that the guy could do amazing things with a paintbrush. And he was very, very smart in his choices, because he knew if he was caught, this would be the end of his career and end up in jail. And eventually he was caught. And however, the consequences are not what you might have expected. Anyway, he did very technically imitations, or not, again, he wasn't forging an existing famous painting. He would study an artist's technique and create a painting in the spirit of that artist, and pass it off as a lost piece by that artist. And so, like, here's a piece by an artist who we know that they painted, say, 30-odd paintings or so, but only 10 of them survived. Others were lost during the Nazi regime, during the Nazi period. and the others, no one knows where they're at. Then he studied that artist's work, their extant work, the work that is known, and created something in that spirit, and then said, oh, here's a lost painting by this artist. And that artist's work was so rare and special that it was worth quite a bit of money. And then he sold his, he was painting, again, works that are not copies of original works, but copies of the style of a particular artist. And he made millions doing this, and he fooled a lot of experts in the art world for decades. Okay, so he finally, after years of doing this successfully, he had help from his wife, who was also an art expert, who was an expert at understanding how the art world worked. Anyway, he gets caught. He finally, what's interesting is the interaction between this, by all accounts, expert forger and the art world. And it raised some questions for philosophers. Why is it that a fake piece, or a piece that is not what it's claiming to be, but is believed to be something else, can be valued less than what it would be worth if it were, in fact, what it claims to be? Especially when people were willing for decades to pay vast amounts of money for this. And it must have impressed a lot of people. So he obviously had talent. Why wasn't his work, why weren't his copies as good when it was discovered that they were forgeries, as good as the originals? There are millions of dollars at stake here. And interestingly enough, and there's a criminal context associated here, because yeah, okay, so he was a forger. He made a lot of money defrauding or frauding other people with a lot of money to spend. But what happened was he went to court and he admitted up front, and he seemed to be rather almost glad he was caught, because he was enjoying the notoriety and he was getting a lot of it. Suddenly though, okay, so he got all kind of, the trial went, it was expected to be a very long trial. It turned out to be a very short trial. What happened was he knew enough about the art world that he admitted, yes, I did these. They're all fakes. And his sentence was, okay, now you have to pay back all these millions that you defrauded people of. He did, okay, and then he got off lightly. I think he was sentenced for just 5 or 6 years, but it was cut short. And then but in Germany, apparently he could stay at home while he was serving his time, and he just had to spend the night at the prison. He didn't go home, and what was he doing when he was home? He was painting more, doing more art. He was supposed to be serving time for having defrauded. Now, but he did change his ways. What he did, okay, he started to paint works under his own name, so they were no longer frauds. And suddenly, the value of his own paintings began to have value. I mean, you can find his website. He has a 7 or 8 figure income from selling his own work. Okay, he got this notoriety from being a forger. Okay, so it's like the clash here is, on the one hand, we think he did something wrong, but many people sympathized with him. And this is where we get beyond art, because they felt that he was basically, those people he duped deserved to be duped. If they had that much money and they were fooled and they allowed themselves to be fooled, maybe they deserved it. And he was sort of considered he and his wife were considered a Bonnie and Clyde of the art world, for having gotten away with this for so long and been so successful at it. He's not, even after being caught and serving some minimal time in jail, he's doing quite well. Now, so the monetary value of his work has skyrocketed, but it raises the question: he did show a lot of intentionality in what he was doing. And his defrauded works do have a context. What's happening here is that there was the history and the surrounding of his 40-year it was an accomplishment to pull this off for 40 years. There is a history, a context, one could say a great deal of courage, along with talent, to pull off what he did. So in a real sense, he is, in his own right now, a great artist. And in case people think, well, you can't become a great artist by just forging other people, very famous artists did that exactly like Michelangelo in his early career faked a lot of art, or painted stuff that was supposedly by artists that were famous in his own time and passed it off as theirs, but he did it. It's not, the history doesn't remember Michelangelo as a fraudster, but he's considered still a great artist because he was. In the case of Beltracchi, the fact that he was able to do it, fool so many experts for so long, is an indication of how good he was. If you combine that with another concept, a willingness, a daringness, a courage to pull this off, you get the formula for what at least one famous philosopher calls genius. And several of the people that are interviewed in this, some of them think he's just talentless and everything, but it seems to me that there's controversy here, because on the one hand, many people feel you can't be a great artist and by basically lying to people, duping them into believing that you're doing something that something isn't what it appears to be. But in this case, well, let me talk about this, what I'm thinking about here. Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, in his book called Culture and Value, tried to define what genius is. He says there's talent and then there's genius. What's the difference? Talent is just the ability to pull something off, to create something that clearly shows a tremendous amount of skill and ability. But that's not enough to be genius. To be a genius, in his view, you have to have some talent, but you also have to have courage. Courage is not a exclusively aesthetic quality. It's a willingness to to take a chance, to put yourself in danger, to face whatever consequences you face that you might suffer as a result of sticking your neck out. And there's a sense in which Beltracchi met those qualifications. There's no doubt that he had tremendous talent. Someone might say, but you can't have talent, be a genius and copy other people's work. You're not original, right? Well, what he did was original. Being a forger on this scale was original. And so we come to the conclusion that what Beltracchi does, and which partly explains why the value of his own work is increasing, is because he really was a performance artist. Okay. In fact, that's how he describes what he was doing. He says he takes great pride in the fact that he's a forger. He says, look, I performed the whole 40 years was a gigantic performance art piece to show you that how easy it is to fool the art world. Look, I did it for 40 years. It was a triumph from his perspective. As a piece of his life was a performance art piece. And as such, it may go down in history as being a work of genius, despite the fact that what he was doing was, strictly speaking, illegal. On the side, it's important to point out that maybe what he was doing was illegal, and he was defrauding people. There was a lot of fraud on the other side as well, because in the art world, there's a tremendous amount, and especially at this level of people buying art for millions of dollars, a lot of tax evasion going on. And that's partly explains why his trial was shortened, because the people who he supposedly made victims of didn't want the truth to come out about where all this money was coming from and where it was going and how it was being used to avoid paying taxes. So basically, it was a fraud. He defrauded other people who were not exactly following the law, all of which created more of a legend around him, which further increased the value of his own work. Okay, so Aaron, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay or no?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, he's an example of someone who is sort of rebranded themselves as a postmodern artist. It's almost a textbook case, I would say. The thing that I think is important, though, is to understand if we are going to redefine our social contracts in such a dynamic way, what those risks are, right? Because what we're really saying is that that what he did was challenge norms by using post-factual and post-truth behaviors, which generated those outcomes. And we can laugh at the assumption of the people who lost, who deserved to lose because they were evading some taxes. I mean, my guess is some were. I'm sure not all of them were in every transaction. That's sort of statistically pretty hard to happen. But I think the bigger issue is that would have to come up, that I think matters with something like this, and allowing someone to just kind of do their thing as a postmodern, post-factual artist, is that you are now challenging one of the fundamental rubrics, I think, in our sense of sort of contract theory around art, which is providence. Because if the goal is to sort of flatten Earth and have a Jacobean revolution, that nothing's nothing, and it's sort of a Hobbesian world of art. I mean, I think it's pretty clear you get to sort of the destruction of art at some point as a mechanism of generating art, and I don't think most people believe that sliding to a place like that is an ideal society, or much less an ideal place that artists that we support or that we would generate. And you could argue punk art and other forms of postmodernism fall into that, but I don't think we would necessarily want to encourage the behavior of deprovidencing sort of everything, because then everything loses all of its value. And
but
I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
no, I think I understand what you're saying, Eric. But and this is going to be the last part of the topic when I'm going to come down to the relationship between, because this forgery story ties into it. What is the relationship between ethics or morality and art? And it's a topic I've dealt with in the past, and it's actually very important here, because I don't think, and I'll let Jeff speak in a moment, that there are three, well, maybe I'll talk about it later, but there is a problematic relationship between art and morality that we're going to discuss in a moment, because I don't think that it's part of art's mission to be moral. Morality is like its own sovereign country. Aesthetics is its own sovereign country. They will conflict with each other, but there's no outside authority. Now, each of them would claim to be an outside authority, but there is no realm of normativity above them that can adjudicate between them. I'll come back to that idea in a moment, but I want to let Jeff talk. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm coming from a Kantian perspective here, and I'm mostly responding to Aaron, but I think it has to do, yeah, I mean, Kant obviously believed that art and morality had a connection, but it was a complicated one. It was about people negotiating what happened, and then sort of teaching themselves to perceive in a way, to have a gut reaction to beauty, and he thought that would be useful once transferred to other decisions in life. I don't, my that's just like the context, but I think the reason people want to have a pedigree for art, that we can say, was it really done by that person, is because they want to shortcut this process that I just described of actually seeing what's beautiful in the art. It's like, oh, that's too much work, or maybe they just doubt that they're going to be able to do it. I mean, there could be a genetic component to a lot of forms of art appreciation, and then you would sort of be barred maybe by from having those opinions. And there's a lot of social worth to having the right opinions about these things. So people want to do it. So it's a typical, I guess I'm just going to call it bourgeois. I mean, we want the shortcut to the good stuff, But Kant is like, you learn how to do this. And maybe we come up with a new way, but it's like painstakingly learned. It's like no. I just want to. Take clothing. Use an example. I buy the label. You buy the label with the name on it that is good. That's easy compared to evaluating what's going on. Someone gives you an outfit. This is my particular favorite. It's easy. That's we do when we do with kids. It's called garanimals, right? To construct an outfit takes hours. so that's just what it's really just a cheapening of it. So I think these forgeries, as Victor is obsessed with, is just basically a case of people casting about to save that way. So we want to be able to have that quick route to determining value, and you shouldn't have it.
Okay.
Is the answer.
Okay. Go ahead, Mike. Mike, you have your hand up.
This debate is kind of front and center now because of what's going on with AI.
Yeah.
What you say, create I don't know, an art form using as though it were created by Da Vinci, or as though it were created by Rembrandt, and it has value. I consider that there are. I've seen some philosophy books, and it sounds like you've implicitly written one today in your notes. The one that comes to mind is Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto, that describes some rules of what constitutes art, and Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, and Bach, that define some rules of what constitutes art. Now, these all seem to fit, including the rule that you said that in some ways is like a crucifix in a bottle of urine. It sells for millions of dollars as art. I also bring a data point in as to what an Elvis impersonator, or the sum total of Elvis impersonators, has made more money than Elvis ever did. So that's all data points on what constitutes art. So I think it's my conclusion is that I wish I understood the rules of neuroscience that make it pleasing, or have some pleasing form of cognitive dissonance that makes it art. I don't totally understand your rules yet, and I don't know if you've documented them in other than this meetup dialogue.
Okay.
So
Thanks, Mike. Actually, if you're asking me personally, I don't have any rules. I don't have any clear about what is art. I'm entertaining ideas by Ellen Winter, she's an artist, by the way, as well as a psychologist. So she's devoted her life to these questions. And she's examining from a psychological or empirical point of view ideas that have been floating around by philosophers for ages. And anyway, but I do want to go back to the two main points she made, though, about context and intentionality, and how the forgery example relates to that. And then we'll get to AI in a moment, because they're actually both going to be in support of her view. Okay, how does intentionality and context, play into the forgery case I described? Clearly, a forger is intending to do something. They're not acting randomly. So that's there very clearly. They were intending to do something. What were they trying to do? Now, the obvious answer is make money, which is indeed he made a lot of. But he also, if you watch the documentary, you also get the sense that this was a project for him. He describes it, and you could say he's just after the fact defending what he did. But there are many performance artists who are out front performance artists who would praise what he did, precisely because it's a part of the mission statement of most serious performance artists to shake things up, to take whatever the prevailing norms are in any field, whether it's morality, politics, you name it, and challenge it, and in a dramatic way. That's, if you look at the last part of the write-up, I quote various performance artists and how they describe what they see, what they're doing, and why it's important. And it is very much about creating, disrupting any kind of established set of norms, whether it's, you name it, and including political, legal, and if you have to be criminal to do it, some artists are willing to go that far. And this connects up with what Aaron was saying about what is the relationship between art and morality. I'll have some things to say about that in a moment. But I do want to come back to, okay, but context and intentionality. Obviously, there was plenty of that in the Beltracchi case. And there was also context. This is a 30 or 40 year period in which he clearly, there's a story behind it. And what he was doing was enabled by a certain, enabled to happen by a certain culture of art out there. And in a way, he was revealing that art culture for what it was. And that is his target, or at least he construes it that way. And even if he doesn't construe it that way, others can. And that's the fact that a performance piece, or in this case, a art/performance piece, can be availed and used this way, is one of the ways in which it expresses the idea which I meant on that list, called imaginative experience. It fires the imagination, what he was able to pull off. And that is one of the hallmarks of art, to be able to do that. And yes, laws are broken. People are considered defrauding to be immoral, but we'll come to that in just a moment. So I do want to come back to that idea here about what is the relationship between morality? Is art somehow, obviously, the fact one can view following the law as well as being moral as a piece of performance. One is performing in a socially acceptable way when one follows the law and doesn't get arrested or locked up. But if one is deliberately breaking the law, knowing full well that that is a possible consequence of their breaking the law, and is doing it because they have a mission, a particular point of view. And this is not that strange. Think of what's called civil disobedience. People who deliberately break the law knowing they're going to be, they'll pay a price for this. That's it. Civil disobedience is a form of performance art, or can be viewed that way. And that's how many performance artists do see what they do. So what is quite a few years ago, one area of philosophy that has always interested me is the realm of normativity. And normativity is basically placing value on things, saying that this is good or bad, right or wrong, correct or incorrect, logical or illogical, beautiful or ugly. Placing value in judging things in that way is what normativity is. It used to be called valuation or value theory. And there is, as far as I can identify them, there are three major areas of normativity. And between them, they cover just about all that people do. And those are logic, ethics, and aesthetics. And of those three, aesthetics is by far the larger. It's the mother of them all. It's simply about what's okay and what's not, what you prefer and what you don't prefer. The logic between those three, logic is the most dictatorial and strict and unbending of the three. There are laws of logic that are supposed to be followed, and if you don't follow them, you're uttering gibberish. And it doesn't bend. Logic doesn't bend very well. No, that's not totally true, because there are some logicians out there who have pushed the limits of it. For example, take the old law of non-contradiction, that a statement can't be both true and not true at the same time. That's been taken as a staple of Western logic since Aristotle, but it's been questioned. And but for the most part, people don't go around saying contradictory things like it's raining outside and it's not raining outside and expect to be understood. But logic is one realm of normativity, whose scope is laying down the rules about what is acceptable and not acceptable within the realm of thought, of reasoning. Ethics is doing the same thing, but it's judging the realm of human interaction with how people interact with each other, or morality, or any kind of creature that we give moral status to. It could be animals as well. It could even be AI someday, or aliens from another planet. But morality, to keep it simple, is about how the rules that govern how humans should interact with each other. And by the way, legality is a very small subset of morality. That's what societies have decided to enforce, what moral rules societies have decided to enforce with consequences if you don't follow them. But morality is much bigger than legality, but it encompasses legality. And then outside of something that encompasses all this, encompasses logic and ethics, is aesthetics. And this is the rules that govern anything, any kind of judgment, period, that isn't covered by those first two, by reason, by logic and ethics, is covered by aesthetics. Whether you like apple or or oranges, whether you like the temperature of your house, a particular at a certain setting or another. 1,000 aesthetic decisions, or 1 million of them, that we make almost every day or experience every day, covers all the normativity that isn't covered by logic and ethics. Now, each of these realms I conceive is like being independent states. It's an analogy, where one country like the United States and Russia and Germany and Mexico or whatever, they pass within their boundaries. They have laws that are local laws that govern their area. And a lot of them would like to say, well, but our laws are not just local. We don't accept certain kinds of behavior, even when it's happening outside of our territorial boundaries. Ethics is especially, and logic are two examples of this. They both want to say that if you're not being logical and if you're not being moral, then what you're doing is unacceptable. Art, or the whole realm of aesthetics, however, is outside, includes them, but it's outside those realms. In aesthetics, in other words, logic has very strict rules. Morality has somewhat pretty strict, but they're slightly more flexible than logical rules. But aesthetics plays with rules. Of course, there are rules that an artist might adopt to govern what they're going to do, but they could easily change them tomorrow. They're flexible, they're fluid. Aesthetics plays with the fluidity of rules in a way that ethics doesn't tolerate, and logic really doesn't tolerate, at least not with a lot of argument and struggle. So aesthetics, what is I think significant and distinctive about art and artists in the art world, is that it's not, strictly speaking, aesthetically wrong to break the law, whether it's moral or even logical law. In fact, it's almost what aesthetics is about. It's about breaking the rules and creating new rules. And of course, there will be consequences. You may go to jail if you break some rules. You may be considered uttering nonsense if you choose to be illogical, but aesthetics doesn't care about that. It's about play, whereas those other two fields are not playing around. They insist. And that is what distinguishes them, just how fluid they are. And so in the case of, for example, this fraud case, of course, the individual artist, Beltracci, his real motive, it was probably complex. Of course, he wanted to make money. His story is very clear. He was all about getting as much money. He was enjoying himself defrauding people. He didn't feel sorry for these people who had millions to spend. Of course, it was illegal, and strictly speaking, it was immoral too. To defraud even a rich person is still immoral. But you could say, as an artist, he must have felt that, I am, in the larger scheme of things, like any performance artist, if he conceived of himself as a performance artist, I am opening up the eyes of the world to something that they need to know about, what the art world is really like. And if it's illegal, what the hell, I'll go to jail. And he did. But the irony is that same system that locked him, that insisted that what he was doing was wrong, allowed him to get away with being a fairly wealthy person today. Why is that? It's as though he was a bad person doing bad things, but as a consequence of what he was doing, he revealed that there were worse people doing worse things. And there's a sense in which that can be, that sort of behavior can be justified. I'm not saying I justify it, but I can see where he might, and some person who took an aesthetics point of view might well take that view. And a lot of performance artists are willing to pay the consequences for whatever laws they break or immorality they perform. Anyway, the bottom line is that there are these three, it's like three sovereign countries: aesthetics, logic, and morality or ethics. And none of them really wants to say that we have to abide by the rules of one of those other two sovereign countries, though they may claim to. Morality especially says we can judge people's behavior, whether they're artists or not. And logicians will tell you you're being irrational. It doesn't matter what else you think you are, you're just being irrational. And they take on that authority. But is there some realm of normativity above and beyond any of these three that can judge between them when they conflict with each other? And that's where I would suggest, I can't think of any. I think that's it. It's like three. There's no United Nations of realms of normativity that can adjudicate between them when they conflict with each other. Of course, there will be consequences, but there's no ultimate arbiter of what is that they can arbitrate between. Anyway, we got some hands up. Philip, you haven't spoken yet. Go ahead, and then Aaron.
So you're will you call yourself an anti-realist when it comes to morality? Is that the position that you're advocating, that strictly an anti-realist, anti-moral realist position? Is that
about okay? Well, I'm not totally sure about that, because, well, first of all, could you define okay, is that my understanding?
So let's define what that means.
What is a realist?
A moral realist would be someone who believes that there are moral facts, i.e. moral facts are mind-independent, objective, outside of space, outside of time, that exists. Now, the question would be, is this natural or not natural? And I don't know. I don't think it's material to go on to that amount of clear resolution. It could be real. It could be not real. I don't care. But do you believe that there are moral facts that are independent of mind?
Well, I'm not even sure what a fact is. I'm a Pyrrhonian skeptic. I'm not sure what a fact is.
I think doesn't he mean Plato's forms? He's just saying
no. Facts, let me clarify.
Form exist.
Basically, facts are what makes propositions true. There is a fact of the matter. So, for example, any propositions, let's take propositions to be linguistic entities that has a value of true or false. They get the true value through whether or not there are facts of the matter that makes the proposition true or false. For example, the proposition that the snow is white is true if and only if there are facts of the world or the states of the affair in the world that makes the proposition true or false. Facts are things that are out there in the world, and propositions, the true or false of a proposition is determined by those facts. So now I'm talking specifically in this case, moral facts such as, unnecessary suffering, unnecessary causing harm to other people is always wrong, etc. These would be example of moral facts. Unnecessary suffering is false. Unnecessary suffering is always wrong. These are moral facts.
Yeah. Okay. Here's how I interpret fact. There are moral facts. If you're arguing from a moral point of view, there's definitely right and wrong. There are also aesthetic facts and there are logical facts. And what I'm saying is they don't have to cohere with each other. They can be in stark conflict with each other, and that's it. In other words, facts opposite facts can do in fact exist, is what I'm suggesting. Not that one isn't a fact. Of course, people, there are things that perform, I think, like what you're talking about. We talk about moral facts.
For moral realists, this is an ontological issue, not so much like what you're talking about. Maybe is something different, but moral realism is an ontological statement about the ontological nature of what moral facts are, not so much distinguishing, So what in terms
okay, but on ontology, I tend to be a skeptic. I don't have any hard and fast rules about what there is in the world. That there is something there. There's phenomenon in the world. Okay, I'm pretty sure of that. What the status of that stuff is seems, I don't know what else to say about it, except that we have to confront it all the time. It's real to the extent that it makes a difference in our lives. But if you mean something beyond that, beyond making a difference in our lives, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
then you're not really a moral realist. If ontology, if you care about metaphysics, you care about what there is out there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what there is out there. I guess is where I stand on that. All I know is that how people actually react and interact with each other in how they value things. Now, I don't even know what the status of these values is, except that you run into them all the time. And to that extent, they're real, to the extent that they affect our experience of the world. To that extent, they're real. Beyond that, I don't know.
I just, judging from what your response is, I take it that you're not a moral realist. You're more of like a more relativist or something, more relativist or instrumentalist or pragmatist, pragmatic. Have some sort of pragmatic view of morality, where I don't know.
Well, I'm not. One of these days, I'll have to make that a topic because I'm not sure where I stand on that issue. But go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, no, great point there, Philip. Because I think and correct me if I'm wrong, where the waterfall falls from the moral realism is into legal realism, right? And so we live in a world of nation states, and we might have, as you pointed out, Victor, our own daily realities, but they're all underneath the constructs of these larger metastructures. And we might not see them. We might not even believe they're there. We might not even want them there. I mean, we might have, but it's almost irrelevant because they are there. They have their own physics in essence, and the physics of the legal realism, right, which is the modern, legalist state, right? I mean, you could argue that is the in many parts of the global north, at least, and I would say encroaching parts of the rest of the world, that's becoming, arguably the modern political religion, and even social religion, and that legal and ultimately there's a morality behind that, because every codified boundary that is considered to be a state then codifies those moral attributes through their legal codes, and hence you get a legal realism. And I think where it applies in a case like this, or an example like this, is how do we define harms, right? I mean, I think when we looked at the harms, which were to, minimally to extravagantly rich people and maybe a handful of museums, we didn't care. What if we found out it was a 40-year grift against old age homes and disabled child care facilities? I mean, would we, celebrate him as some kind of amazing postmodern, your relatives artist, or we'd probably say he's a pretty bad odious human being? So the harms do matter, right? And so, and I think to tie this sort of full circle, and Philip, like I said, correct me, is that if we say the harms matter, then the degree of meaning that can exist from those aesthetics are directly connected to those harms, especially when someone would generate those harms. And we might not like that. It might make us feel icky in the super creative world because we don't like those kind of contradictions, because we always like to stay on that, we'll call it the good side of the force of creativity. But, there's been a percentage of, let's just say, less than acceptably morally normative people who've created art, and to the point that I remember 20 years ago, and this was always a really like weird conversation, but people were arguing, or not, some people were arguing that terrorism was a form of political performance art. And I think if those of you are old enough and remember that back from the early 2000s. So I mean, I think that pretty much died down pretty quickly. But the point is that we do have, or we could argue we have a set of legal realisms that exists, that we say, here's the lines, here's the boundaries, right? Here's the yellow lines. And,
of course.
And to make the last quick point here, could he, as a performance artist, done this one time after 25 fantastic years of a career in producing all this, great art that he can produce, and this would have been his one-time homage to postmodernism, and then maybe even 10 years later do it a second time, and that's his ooh gotcha. I mean, versus he did it 40 years, and then we could ask the larger question: what if he never got caught and it was a deathbed confession? I mean, was he really an artist at that point, or was he just a straight forger? I mean, what's the difference between that and someone who, it's almost impossible to forge currency anymore, but someone, let's pretend you could forge bearer bonds and they got caught on the deathbed. We don't call that person an artist. We would call them a criminal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what I was saying earlier about these three independent realms, from my perspective, they are independent of each other, but if you're within those realms, you assert your authority over the other two. So if you're arguing from a moral perspective, of course what he did was wrong. It's obviously wrong. And of course there are consequences for doing something wrong if you're judging from a moral point of view, because moral judgments, especially when they get transformed into legal judgments, when there's actually laws, socially constructed laws that enforce those moral precepts, then of course it's a real thing out there, like a thunderstorm or a mountain. You will have to contend with it. Okay, but there is no judgment outside of morality that isn't itself a moral judgment. Aesthetics is not connected in any essential way with morality. It's got its own standards. Same thing with logic. Logic is even stricter than morality. You really have to fight hard to deny one of the basic rules of logic, but it's doable and it's been done. In fact, I talked about it some time ago. But I think that I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not saying that this forger book on Beltracci was somehow a good person. No. But do artists have to be good people? And I'm suggesting there's no connection between. You can be a good person, you can be an artist, you can be both, you could be neither. But there's no essential connection between the two. There are lots of examples of artists who behave badly, by all accounts. Take Michelangelo, for example. He forged too. I don't hear people talk about it much, but he did. And he did it for money too.
I mean, the forgery is not a parallel, though, is it?
What'd you say? What?
The forging in his early career, and that was an accepted social practice by an enormous amount of people in workshops.
Okay.
I don't think that's a parallel. I mean,
okay, was it an acceptable practice by an enormous amount of people? Is that the standard then of what is a moral standard? That's an odd.
I mean, in a legal realist way, it is because if those workshops, which I would say were fairly unhealthy environments towards the marginalized workers in those shops, they took their own methods to get any advantage they could. You could argue that was like proto-unionism, really, in its own little way.
Well, acceptable practice by a large number of people, though, is a suspect morality. Think of the slavery in the American South, or not. Or
agreed, but I mean, you're comparing 40 years of forgery and then a late career to Michelangelo's production of a small period and when he was very young to a huge career.
Okay, well, okay. Let's. I'm playing the devil's advocate here. I think you can make exactly the same argument in defense of Beltracci that you can make in the case of Michelangelo. Early in his career, he did forge. he got to a point where he didn't need to forge anymore. He could do quite well. And Beltracchi has reached that level. He's got a 7-figure income based on no longer duping anybody. He's selling his own paintings for a good price.
But if he continued to forge and was never caught, are we suggesting he just would have stopped forging and just gone on to some magical career?
No, it would not have improved his moral status. But there's another factor here that judging what he did, not so much him in particular, but the consequences of what he did in the larger scheme of things, and that is to expose a culture of corruption that extended far larger than him. And that's one of the fallouts. And it also explains why he got such a light sentence. I mean, people did not want him to say too much because a lot of other people were at least as shady as he was, and they didn't want to be revealed, and they were quite wealthy. And that's why he got away so lightly. It's like he exposed some rotten behaviors in the art world that people didn't want exposed, or they wanted to cut it off as quickly as possible. He admitted that he did it. Okay, let's give him a slap on the wrist and let him go. We don't want to, press too hard on this because it'll get too much publicity, and that could hurt other people. So it was a social phenomenon much bigger than just him, and that in which he played a part in. Anyway, but yeah, I don't want to be seen as like defending what he's doing or anything, but my point is just that, and I'm going to be talking actually in a couple of months. I'm going to be doing another topic on these 3 realms of normativity and explain it in greater detail as to why it seems to me to be that way, and how there's no overarching realm of shoulds and shouldn'ts that isn't encompassed by one of these 3, by logic, ethics, and aesthetics. And then of the 3, the one that is most fluid is aesthetics. And there may be in the ecological or scheme of things a good reason for that, and that is that reform, progress in logic and ethics doesn't come, like as it would in any country, doesn't come from people following rules. It comes from people stepping outside the rules and confronting the internal hypocrisies and weaknesses of each of these realms. So if any particular moral or political or doctrine becomes enshrined, in a way, aesthetics is free to challenge it, even if it means, of course, there will be a price to be paid for it, but that's part of the game. And I think only aesthetics is licensed to do that, because logic and morality got their rules, and they're very strict. And I'm not saying they shouldn't.
Question.
Yeah.
The 3 of you who've been talking just now sound like professional philosophers would, and I'm not. But are you talking about whether there are absolute moral rules, whether there are moral absolutes or not moral absolutes? And if you are, how does that relate to what is art?
Because what is art is a question that got raised in this forgery example, and it also comes up in AI examples, for example. But that maybe we want to. I was going to talk about that too, but I don't know if we have time unless people want to stick around for that. But in trying to answer the question, what is art? We have one of the things we have to do is, well, what is it not? What is art not? And it isn't morality, and it isn't reasoning. It's about creating values and then potentially destroying those values. And you want to say, well, why? Why would you create something only to make it vulnerable to being changed or destroyed later? Well, because that's what art is. That's what makes it distinctive. It's fluid. Of course, there are aesthetic values, and they may reign for a while, and then people want something new and different. Where is this premium on originality and uniqueness come from in art if it isn't that? It's like whatever doctrine, whatever most people think is the case, is like a target just waiting for an artist to take it down. that's the realm of aesthetics. Now, we're not talking just about entertainment here. I mean, there's friendly aesthetics, which keeps us, entertained. But I'm suggesting that aesthetics is its own realm. It creates its own rules, and of course, it can be criticized and attacked, and correctly so, from a moral point of view, and from a logical, rational point of view. But nevertheless, aesthetics can fight back. And that's when I said that's where the analogy with sovereign countries comes into play. No country can tell another country, your rules are wrong, except by starting a war with them, which we're going to talk about next time. But
this is Kate with one final comment for the social construct.
Mhm.
There have been many exhibitions now, and even people making collections of forgeries to sort of honor this change in your terms.
Yeah, that's interesting, Kate. So now forgery. Well, Beltraki says himself he considered what he was doing to be a type of art. It was a performance art. So forgery now is one way to do art, in other words. Which is supposed to be ironic, but that it does fly in the face of those people who think, well, no, that's not right. You can't. It's not right to dupe people, and it isn't. But aesthetics have to obey that rule? Does it will obey the rule only as long as it can get away with it, and it will always have some sympathy from those people out there who do see that morality and logic sometimes are a little bit dictatorial and deserve to be shown up for what, that. Think of morality, for example. Moral reform almost always happens from the bottom up or from outsiders who are not content with the status quo. It comes from people who are willing to face consequences. As I said earlier, civil disobedience is a violation of law.
Before we say goodbye, I'd personally be really interested, now that we've had this discussion, of what AI would say to the question, what is art?
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll talk
Somebody
about
said they offered to put things we said into their AI machine, I think.
that. Okay, well, the relevance of AI to this, it's another example that I think Ellen Winter used to help shore up her conclusion that context and intentionality are maybe not totally defining of art, but they're very close to being essential to being art. There's in the write-up, there's a little image of, and you can find it online, of a Rembrandt, or a piece that was generated by some AI. And what it did is it studied all the extant Rembrandts in great detail to learn how Rembrandt, what colors palettes he used, what his subjects were, what his brush strokes were like, just a vast amount of detail about his style, his technique, and the way he worked. And with all that vast information, it was then programmed to create a new Rembrandt, not a copy of an existing Rembrandt, but something, the kind of thing that would be in the spirit, something that Rembrandt might have painted. And as you can see, the example in the write-up, a lot of people were quite impressed by it. Okay, so what's wrong? But some people aren't impressed by it. Okay, what are the people that are not impressed by it? And then, if you had presented me with that painting and not told me that it was done by AI, I wouldn't have been able to argue with you, because I don't know enough about Rembrandt to say that it isn't a Rembrandt. And it certainly does look to me like something that was painted by Rembrandt or somebody like him. But it isn't going to, but in the eyes of many, it is not art. And I say not art, it's something, it's an accomplishment, an achievement perhaps, but it's not art, at least not the art it seems to pass itself off at. It's not a piece of visual art. What it is, if it is art, it's actually an achievement, perhaps a great achievement, of the programmers. It's who created it, who created the mechanism that allowed it to be. One of the definitions that Dutton, which I didn't talk that much about, is that part of what makes something art, and this is related to the context and intentionality, is that it be understood as an achievement by something that wanted to achieve something. The only achievement in this is the achievement of the programmers, not of the AI. That's an achievement, and to the extent that was successful, they actually did create something. It isn't a painting by Rembrandt. It's an AI that creates paintings like that could have been made by Rembrandt. That's the achievement, but it is a piece of art in the sense that it isn't what it appears to be. It is an achievement. You can have achievements, great achievements outside of art, in science, in many other fields, things that took a tremendous amount of effort and work by an individual or many people working together, and they are great things. But that's not art. Not by itself, it's not art. Not unless you stretch the term way beyond meaning, because achievement is not the same thing as art. That art has achievement as being perhaps an important part of it is true, but achievement alone doesn't pull it off. And what's missing from the Rembrandt or fake Rembrandt is that the sense of intentionality. There wasn't a thing there except the programmers who intended it to create such an AI, but their achievement was the creation of the AI, not the creation of the Rembrandt piece. That was a side effect of their creation of the AI. So there's no intentionality. What?
I was just speaking of what AI would say, a definition that AI would give of what is art. That's what I was talking about. Not that AI would create art or have anything to do with that part of it.
Okay, I'll let maybe Mike answer this, but my guess is that it would survey all the human knowledge that's ever been said about art and then give you some summary and spit it out.
I just tried it. It came out a lot like your initial definition. It just listed a bunch of bullet points.
Yeah.
Your definition was good. I mean, it sounded like that. But when you say that AI art lacks intentionality because the programmers, it's an achievement of the programmers, but I think modern AI is kind of it works based on how you prompt it. So if you prompt it and you're thereby expressing intentionality in your prompt. So if you're saying I want to whatever comes to mind, I want a Stratocaster that looks like the the Chrysler Building or something, that's your intentionality. So you, the user, not the programmer. I guess, the programmer would be more like the analogous to whoever gave you the paints and the medium, perhaps. So there's my opinion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. The other thing, essential element, is context. By context, it means in an art piece, what people look for, even ordinary non-artists, ordinary people get out of a painting, is they imagine something of the mind of the artist reaching out to them. And then once you know this is a piece by an AI, you no longer think of what you have in common with this AI. If they were a flesh and blood person, you can relate to that because they're not, and they're not. That context and together with the intentionality just isn't there. It's a different kind of experience. It might be an enjoyable experience. There's a lot of, mass-produced art that doesn't require much intelligence to produce or intentionality or context. The context is people buy it. They like it having around their artificial flowers for your house, for example, even when they're artificial, where's the art in it? But it still might give you some kind of pleasure. It may have some of the elements on that list, but not enough for one to say that it's art. Anyway.
Why are you making these? You're saying that this is not art, this is not art, this is art, this is art. Like, it seems to me it's just your preference.
Yes.
I think that you feel like art is some sort of honor. It's like, okay, art as a society, right? We look at when we say that something is an art, we make it honorific. We elevate it from everything else, and say that this is very special compared to that. Like, someone take a picture of a toilet and say that, hey, this is art, and because of that, we put it on the wall, and everyone admires that, because now, by the fact that it's not just a picture of a toilet, it is an art. Then it's worth millions of dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, what grounds that belief, right? What makes something really art? What makes something really special? Shouldn't be just about preference. I mean, AI, they come up with some really amazing stuff.
Yeah.
But you're gonna say
Well,
that they are not.
Well, I'm none of the ideas I've been giving here, except the ones about normativity, there are really mine. I'm talking about theories of psychologists of art and philosophers of art like David Dutton and Alan Winner, who argue that that the intentionality and context are very close to being essential elements of art. Something lacking both is perhaps what I said earlier about art aesthetics being highly fluid may one day overturn that concept, because I'm trying to say that aesthetics doesn't have rules. So if I call it art, it's art. Okay, that's a simple rule. However, that's sometimes it sounds like you're mixing up the other question, which I started at the beginning. There's one question is what is and is not art. The second question is whether it's good or bad art. That very well might be a subjective, eyes in the art, beauties in the eyes of the beholder type answer. Yeah, what's good or bad art has a lot to do with your personal experience and what you have been exposed to, what you like, what everything from biology to psychology to your personal biography. All of that goes into deciding what you like and don't like. But that, according to Ellen Winter, who, by the way, I think she would be called an aesthetic realist. She does believe there is such a thing as objectively art and stuff that isn't. Right? And she's trying to lay down the criteria for what that would be. I'm not sure that I'm a realist about aesthetics any more than I'm a realist about ethics either. But I think it's an interesting idea, and it may be operating at the realm of psychology and not ontology, though. Is it
intentionality is an essential aspect of what makes an art?
Context, that the artist is reacting to an experience of the world that they're depicting. Okay, this is true with humans. Whether it's true of AI seems to be doubtful. That the programmers are actually reacting is obviously true, but the AI itself is interacting with the world and deciding, I want to make this, and that's hard to believe.
Well, it sounds like a variation of, there's a lot of arguments raging now about whether modern AI actually understands or not. And usually, often people don't really define what understanding is, and we don't even necessarily know what it is anyway. So this sounds like a variation of that understanding debate. So if the machine is going to generate art, who are we to say to what extent it understands what it's doing or not? I mean, it may have concepts, it may have learned concepts and context. It's just not in a way that we can even see, really. Or
yeah,
Philip, I believe I heard you say that all art is just preference.
No,
and I'm not sure.
I'm saying that honorific. I think that a lot of people want to put something in a pedestal. Or I don't know how you say it, and they call it art, and it's just a matter of, hey, you know what? Even though I like chocolate and you like vanilla, but because I call chocolate art, you should like chocolate as well. That's kind of what I'm thinking at. But okay. I have to think about philosophy part, because I don't have a lot of experience studying this. I don't know. I mean, I don't. I'm sorry, I just don't know.
Okay.
I
Okay.
don't understand that the context, you need context or intentionality, that kind of stuff. But Yeah.
Okay, well, unless somebody else has some final comments, I'm gonna go ahead and close it here, okay? Thanks, everybody who's still here and everybody else who left early. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And next time, we're gonna be talking about something called just war theory, which has been around for 800 years at least, and has gone through, is currently being facing a lot of criticism because some people think. Anyway, so any final comments from anybody? Okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
thanks,
you.
everybody. Okay,
Yeah.
bye.
Okay, thank you for doing this.
Okay.
Yes, yes.